From the day he was born, Rourke's fate was decided as a child of the Corps. He would take his role as a sniper, training tirelessly to that end, never knowing a different option and never knowing a different world, until a fateful trip to the surface would change it all. Long Gone Days is an interesting take on the RPG genre, and one that, while I personally enjoy it, I also know that it may not be for everyone due to some of the topics it digs into over the course of its about 10-hour long story. And unlike other more traditional turn-based RPGs, the battles in this game feel far more intentional, since there is no grinding, character levels, or anything like that. Just new gear and dealing with obstacles and choices, even if some of them have guns. Now, this review will have some spoilers due to the heavy story focus of the game, and while I will try to push them to the end of the video, there are going to be those of you wanting to avoid any chance of them. So the quick summary is that this is a good game if you're looking for a story-driven RPG that focuses on more down-to-earth character development, language barriers, and trauma, rather than romance options and supernatural entities. And short of an odd choice towards the end of the game, the enemies are more down-to-earth, one-time event kind of things as well, that you run into at specific locations. So despite the fact that some of them are reused a few times in terms of generic enemies, you never feel like you're facing ambiguous onslaughts of never-ending battles, but rather intentionally working your way through zones and normal inhabitants of them. So if all that sounds interesting to you, it may be worth taking a look at this title on your platform of choice, which includes most modern platforms thanks to their publishing agreement that let this game go that last mile to completion. Now, in terms of the legally required press key disclosures, I already owned a copy of this game from early access, but was given access to the beta branch of 1.0 so I can provide this coverage in a timely fashion. So no idea how that fits into disclosures, but there you go. Now, into the actual deeper dive, this game does something interesting that you don't see too often in RPGs. It plays around with languages, and I don't mean made-up ones, but actual real-world languages. Specifically, your choice of default language as well as Russian, Polish, and German. Though how this works to play through if you set your default language to one of those, I'm not entirely certain, since I didn't have time to test it because I'm not fluent enough in German to play through the game in it proper. But the way it works normally is that NPCs in a region, as well as any documents, television shows, etc. that you see, will try to speak to you in their native tongue. And the one language I have a rough grasp of, in this case German as I said, actually made sense if you read it yourself. So it will be an entirely different experience for a polyglot. But for those of us that aren't super fluent, you'll need to progress the story until you befriend someone that can translate for you. Whether that's an ally that will join you in battle, or a friend that will just follow you around town, depends on where you're at in the story. This, in and of itself, was interesting to me, and I think it was a good way to approach the social barriers that you would encounter while traveling around regions of the world. Even having it going so far at one point as having someone try to communicate back to you in broken English to thank you for what you've done. As far as your language, which I think is canonically English, just by the backstories of some of the translators in a certain scene later on, it can be whatever you want though. But you learn this language because of your origin as a child of a military organization known as the Corps, which if you do some side quests, you can learn why they call the leader the Father General, you can learn a bit about the mothers, and why you were raised down there, even seeing some of the infants and incubators, and you can even learn a bit about why you're brainwashed into your rigid role in this underground society that is trying to shape the world. Now, the story itself unfolds over the course of a matter of days, and that is even mechanically reflected in an almost harsh manner with your resources in life, since you do not recover these very often in story events, and have to rely on recovering them through battle or items for a lot of the experience. And the interesting way this is tied into battles is that, for the majority of them, at least up until the very end, you're given a choice between an item reward at the end of battle or recovering a bit of your SP, basically your skill points, that let you use your special abilities. This setup led to me being even more stingy with my resources, which is part of growing up on old NES RPGs, but also because I wasn't sure when or if I was going to be able to recover them again. so saving them for important boss fights became my norm, and ended up with me being engorged with tools for the final encounters, in exchange for having a tougher time with earlier boss fights, though they were still doable, just harder. I would say if you're just playing through, you don't need to be as restrictive on your uses as I was, since later on, you'll get enough options through skills that you'll be able to make up for any times you wasted items earlier. I would just say a handful of the caffeinated items you'll find to refill your SP towards the end are pretty important, and use the healing items themselves liberally as long as you aren't going to go over your max. Gear-wise, you'll see a few upgrades, including a few hidden ones, but not so much as to be overwhelming. Basically, you'll end up with a dozen or so pieces of excess equipment, so keep an eye out for vents, key cards, tokens, and keys laying around, since often the better improvements are hidden behind side quests and side paths. And even though the game is able to be beaten without them, they do make life a lot easier. This all does help with the immersion though, since buckshot from one shotgun is not going to be that much different from buckshot from another shotgun. The last somewhat important aspects are the puzzles, and yes, I'm actually including the sniper section in this, since while it's a key component, there's only a few of them, and the puzzle aspect is figuring out the route through them to dispose of the enemies efficiently, since the aiming portion is fairly easy, but you are working on a time limit as well as an ammo limit, though I was able to get both of these just going in blind, even if it was pretty close on the last big one. The other puzzles, though, I would gripe about a bit, since sure, you have the sliding block type stuff, or juggling locks where it closes one door but opens another, but all of those are fairly straightforward and standard. The annoying ones are the unlock puzzles, where you basically need to find the code or key to unlock a path. Numpads specifically were a bit annoying since you can't even attempt to brute force them, which means you cannot just memorize them for speedruns and such. Basically, the way a lot of them function, outside of a certain chess puzzle at the end of the game, is that you need to find the code in the region, then go back and choose the right option from a list. And until you find that code, you just won't be given a list or an entry method to begin with. These types of find it, then pick the right one out of 3 type puzzles are generally a pet peeve of mine, and I know for most people it won't matter, but I'd rather have a proper keypad if I'm going to have to memorize something from another location. In the more superficial stance, as far as graphics go, I'm usually not a fan of tall sprites, but this game makes them work quite well and they're proportioned properly, and the vignettes and cutscenes really add to the style, making it a little bit more comic book oriented in its feeling. The music is similarly solid, and there were points in writing this review where I've actually had it running in the background just to enjoy it. As far as bugs, I only encountered a few, and then upon reporting them to the devs, they were fixed within a couple hours. While I can't say this will be the case after release, they are responsive and quick to squash out bugs and push fixes through. So as long as something similar continues into release, I'd expect a day 1 or 2 patch to clean up any bugs that crop up at 1.0 release and the wider reach. Now to get into the spoilers, namely the story as well as the oddity that is the final boss. As was said, we start at the core, we're a trainee sniper, and we're sent to replace one that broke his arm and still needs time to heal, since we cannot delay our mission or else the core's goals will be lost. We get a basic rundown of the mentality within the core, a handful of side quests which I recommend doing for backstory and items, since it introduces you to the upgrade system that will be important later, as well as gives you some decent recovery items just for exploring the environment. As we get to the surface, the game is quick to drop hints as to what the story is going to be about, especially if you pay a close attention to the environment and what you're doing. But even if you aren't, you'll usually hit the real information about it within a couple hours of starting the game and realize what the core is up to and why we must stop it. This is also when you start to see your decisions rather than just your interactions influencing the morale of your party. High morale and you'll find battles easier, low morale and they'll get slightly harder. Not punishingly so, but a bit, so try to make decisions and interactions that will send positive vibes out rather than negative vibes. Now, the first zone where you're away from the core, you'll get to learn the basic battle mechanics, get a bit deeper into the quest mechanics, and get your first translations, and even your first experience with a negative event if you dig deep enough into a certain story path, which I think adds to the immersion since nothing is going to be all good. You also learn of the suffering and struggles of the victims of your actions as well as the suffering from the actions of the core. You'll get to see the side effects of trauma and strife on people, even if not 100% accurate, since I think that would be a bit too much. It does at least give you the high points without dragging you down the deep depression alley. This is also where you'll face your first proper boss, which sets the tempo for most of the boss fights in the game, where you'll have the initial target, but they will bring in allies mid-fight, sometimes get heals, and use abilities similar to your own, and they will incentivize you to use the proper battle mechanics of choosing the target to harder to hit head for more damage, the middle road arms to attempt to rob enemies of their turns, or just go for the core for just steady, lowish damage. Now, despite having played it before, I still found this first boss to be the hardest of the game, simply because I avoided using items for the most part, and you also lack the diversity of skills. But beating him, you will progress to the second day and start on your way out of town, hopefully having finished all of the side quests, which it does help you out with by putting a tracker in your menu screen that hints you along the way. This is thankfully true of all the regions you go to, though as we get to Germany, our next stop on the line, it incorporates some quests for day and some for night, as indicated on the quest log, so you're not wasting your time trying to find impossible to achieve goals just yet. This is also the first segment where our choices start to matter in the world. Do we make a deal with the devil or take him out? There's achievements here for choosing certain ones. If you're going for that 100%, but as a force of vengeance, I chose violence, especially after what they did. This area is also the spark that starts unlocking character backstories, yours for other characters, as well as unlocking the other characters with each other, which interestingly ties more into the core than you may have first realized, letting you learn about how long the frankly disturbing actions have been going on, and it does set up the utterly despicable boogeyman for us to face off with, which, while cheesy, is somewhat necessary in a shorter game. I do wish there was more nuance here, but we have to remember, this is a short story, not a novel. Finally, after picking up easily our strongest party member and again finishing up our side quest if we can, we move on to our ultimate destination after fighting through a rather large dungeon-esque sequence for the obligatory prison break, and find ourselves approaching the target of all these struggles. Poland. While not as complex as the German segment of the game, Poland has its own interesting side quests that bring a lot more personality and friendliness between the characters, somewhat cementing the camaraderie, and we even get to have a bit of a jam-out session if we look around enough. And then we ultimately begin our plan to confront the core and reveal their actions to the world to strip them of their ill-gotten power. The tower we fight through in the end is pretty interesting, and it does have the first actual manual puzzle lock in the form of chess pieces that I think works really well since it has a fairly nicely layered hint system associated with it, and I think it is probably one of the better puzzles in the game. The aesthetic is nice, and you have a few branches in the story here as well that allow you to somewhat affect the ending of the game. This also has the toughest sniper segment in the game, with some fairly tight time constraints, though since the sniping is relatively easy and straightforward, I think most people will be able to get it on their first or second try, and will likely feel invested to do so. Though, despite all this positive, I feel the ultimate plan we had was a bit abnormal and lacked experience with social engineering methods, and the capstone of the final boss was a bit too out of character for the game as well, since up to now we had been facing what would amount to normal soldiers, drones, and other such enemies that would make sense in a place like this. But the final boss weirdly pulls a Saturday morning cartoon move by mounting a turret to fight from and even spawning additional turrets around him, and it feels very out of place just where it is. That said, the fight itself is fine, I just wish it would have been a bit more down to earth. Maybe introducing special bodyguards rather than over-the-top fight with the final boss himself. Heck, even a helicopter fight or an escape sequence would have made it a bit more logical to me. That said, overall though I really enjoyed my time with the game, it did not overstay its welcome, it respected my time, the fights were not complete pushovers and let you play around with different tactics. Though I did ultimately kind of figure out a cheese technique that prevented me from ever worrying about dying, but I would not be surprised if it gets patched in the future update to restore a bit of balance. Now, I would note that I think the price point is a little steep for a 10-hour game, but it is a good experience worth trying, and you can tell a lot of thought and passion went into it. I'd recommend if you think you'll enjoy it, pick it up, but if you're on the fence, maybe wait for it to hit a sale. Either way, the quality is there, and I don't regret spending an entire weekend playing it, and really, it is a great example of the scope that indie RPGs should be aiming for. You don't need a grand 100-hour adventure to make a compelling story and experience.